Welcome to Independent Thinkers on Digital, a series which seeks to gain insight through incisive dialogue with some of the world's leading independent thinkers on matters related to digital technology. I'm William Webb. I'm the CTO at Access Partnership, and fairly well known, I think, for my willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and to try and cut through the hype. My guest today is Steve Unger. Steve is a technologist by background who started out as a radio astronomer before working for the first company to challenge a telecoms incumbent using fixed wireless. When that failed, he became a regulator, and he spent almost 20 years at Ofcom, which is where our paths first crossed. He set strategy for regulation in the UK, he represented the UK internationally, he acted as the CTO, and for a brief period was even acting CEO. He's now got a mix of advisory and non-executive roles, and in his spare time is writing a book about the first 200 years of telecoms regulation. And that's really where I wanted to start. You've got some interesting insights, Steve, around the fact that technology has changed dramatically, but maybe economics haven't. Take us through what your thesis is going to be for the new book.
Sure. So the basic point is that, of course, we've seen a vast amount of technological disruption over the last 200 years. So you can track that through the optical telegraph, 1790s, the electric telegraph, the telephone, cable networks, data networks, broadband. So there's been an amazing change in the technologies we use, but a lot of the economic themes sort of persist. So concerns around the availability of networks, for example, they've persisted over 200 years. And we're now at a point where we're starting to think about the economics of digital platforms, and people are starting to think about how you regulate those platforms. And I guess my basic thesis is that history doesn't have the answers to what we should do now, but you at least ought to understand what happened historically before you start trying to work out what the answer is going forward. So that's the high level point. I can give a couple of specific examples, but yeah.
That would be great if you could do that to sort of bring it into to the flesh a bit more.
Well, okay, so maybe 2 points. But the first point I want to make is that, we get very excited about digital disruption nowadays, but it's not new. So the example I quite like is when the optical telegraph first arrived in the 1790s. That was a means of sending messages digitally, actually, over long distances. And it was quite radical for its time. To bring that to life slightly, the first optical telegraph line in Britain ran from London to the south coast, and it was used to track movements of ships, basically. At that point in time, the sort of state of art in communications was the stagecoach. And a stagecoach carrying letters took 17 hours to get from London to Dover. The newspapers covering the first optical telegraph messages were astounded by the fact that it now took 4.5 minutes to send a message. So it's not quite broadband.
Yeah.
But compared to what had come before it, it was really radically new. Instead of waiting days for messages, it was minutes. So there's very disruptive technology. You then wind forward and ask about economic themes, and there are several economic themes worth thinking about. But let me pick interconnection, because that's a topic that's been talked about a lot at the moment, interconnection and interoperability in the context of digital platforms. And very often the people who propose application of interconnection or interoperability to digital platforms call on the historic experience with telecoms. So I think it's worth looking at what actually happened, crudely.
Yeah.
Basic interconnection, very long history to interconnection. I think the first interconnection agreement was 1849. That led to the creation of the Austro-Prussian Telegraph Union, which was the precursor of the ITU. And then in 1865, as I think many of you will know, we had the ITU. So the ITU, the first International Telegraph Convention, which established Morse code as the first global interoperability standard. From a competition perspective, though, what was interesting was that during that same period, particularly in both the United Kingdom and the United States, you had a number of private telegraph companies competing with each other. And what they eventually did, generally what they did was formed cartels. And they used the ability to refuse interconnection to police those cartels. At the time, there was nothing that could be done about it, because this was before antitrust law. So basically, telegraphy, the growth of telegraphy was shaped by cartels policed by a refusal to interconnect. So that's, I guess, the first economic bit. You then wind forward to the telephone, 1880, that arrived. Again, when the telephone first arrived, particularly in the United Kingdom, United States, and also Sweden, actually, you had a number of competing private telephone companies. And the model of competition was that they refused to interconnect with each other. So you had an incumbent, the Bell system in the United States, the National Telephone Company in the United Kingdom. They refused to interconnect with the independents. So what you got was something called dual service, where in order to talk to other telephone users, you basically had to have two telephones. And that was a bit crap. What tended to happen was that the early regulators, I think particularly in the United States, this was generally state utility commissions, they went one of two ways. They either forced consolidation, so there was only a single operator, or they mandated interconnection, so basically got rid of dual service in that way. And probably the best example then of mandated interconnection was in Stockholm, which was the most vibrant European market for telephony, tele-density much higher than any other European city. And what you had there was competition between a state-owned incumbent and a municipal commercial network, but where they interconnected with each other. So that was an early demonstration of what interconnection can achieve. So interconnection definitely delivered benefits in that case. We then had about 50 years where we gave up on competition. So in Europe, we basically nationalised our operators, and in the US, basically, regulators learned to coexist with the Bell system rather than taking them on. From about 1970 onwards, we again had a resurgence of competition, liberalisation starting in the US, coming across to Europe. And liberalisation, I think the two great early successes of liberalisation were in long-distance calls, and that was enabled by essentially a form of interconnection called equal access, and in equipment markets enabled by interoperability between devices and networks. So again, that worked really well. So you've got that history of interconnection working really well over that period. But two big caveats. One is it's just very complicated. So in the UK, during that period of liberalisation, the first interconnection dispute was resolved by Oftel, I think in 1985. I joined Oftel about 15 years later, and we were still resolving interconnection disputes. So, those people who think that interconnection is an easy answer, years, decades of disputes to get it right. Yeah. And the other issue is about innovation, that you are essentially constraining everyone to use the same interface. And I guess that's where I branch off again and look at essentially the history of the internet, because the whole point of the internet, the model that was created in the 1970s for a globally interconnected network was, of course, a layered model, quite different from where we've been with telephony. And the basic idea, everyone should know this, is that you had global connectivity provided at the IP layer of the stack and differentiation at the application layer of the stack. So get the best of both worlds. You get global connectivity, but you also have the differentiation that comes with being able to use different types of applications. And I suppose if I then take that model and apply it going forward, if I look at the debate that's going on at the moment about interoperability between different over-the-top platforms, my basic point would be that first, interconnection can be really powerful where it's really necessary, but it has a cost, and a blanket application of interoperability or interconnection at the application layer of the internet feels a pretty stupid thing to me to do. You need to be quite judicious in how you apply regulation of that layer. So there's something about, regulation is sometimes necessary. In the early days of the Bell system, if interconnection had been applied properly, we might never have seen the Bell system emerge as quite as dominant as it did. But you can also get it wrong.
The debates that are going on at the moment, I think you're right. They seem to be a bit misinformed to me. So the one that I've seen most recently is around the metaverse, which of course is still incredibly embryonic, but a debate that there should be, even before we realise what it is, there should be some kind of standardisation so that you can have an outfit that you develop in one world that you can take to a different world, and they're interoperable and that kind of thing. And there's actually some standards bodies even starting to be formed in that space at this point in time. And like you, I kind of shudder a bit and think, well, how are they going to even decide what to standardise, let alone write the standards themselves? But the call seems to be one of, well, interconnectors, standardisation has worked so well for interconnect. Clearly, you need it everywhere else. So I guess you would push back a bit and say,
no, that's what I'm pushing back against. So I think if you go back 100 years when you had the most obvious example of this was during, I guess, the beginning of the 20th century, the Bell system and the independents more or less shared the market. The independents had about half the market. In the end, what wiped them out was the use of interconnection. So in that context, I suspect that mandated interconnection would have been the right thing to do. Actually, connection, there was an intervention. The Kingsley Commitments was badly, that's a whole other story. It was a badly designed intervention. But it did make sense then. If I look now, firstly, the internet, it does interconnect. That's sort of the point of IP.
Yeah.
And secondly, your point about the metaverse, none of us have a clue what that is. None of us have a clue whether it's a federated metaverse, whether it's a series of individual applications, and so on and so on and so on. So the idea that a regulator could write a standard for that, for me, that's mad, actually.
Why do you think there are those calls? Is it a play by some of the big players to grab? What's going on there? Because it does seem to be sort of the proponents of the metaverse almost, or some of them at least, that are asking for it. Or is it everyone's worried that Meta is going to take over that space entirely, and they're trying to carve out a way to prevent that?
Well, I think part of it goes back to the more fundamental question of even what the metaverse is. So, presumably there was a vision of the metaverse, which is, we're going to go around the sort of app store story again, and, whoever grabs territory first will get to dominate this new world. All metaverse applications will be hosted by a provider, and everyone wants to grab that. So, that's one version of the truth, but nobody knows. So I think there's some commercial incentives which make perfect sense. So it's always the case, whenever you talk about these things, there are natural splits commercially, and you just need to recognise that people have incentives to promote particular ideas. Nothing wrong with that. What I worry about at the moment is the extent to which, particularly in the EU at the moment, and I'm not anti-EU, I emphasise, but there is this idea that the Digital Markets Act creates a framework of a series of obligations which you apply almost regardless of effects. And when you don't even know what the metaverse is, to us, I don't even know whether the metaverse is virtual reality or augmented reality. So it's this debate. Metaverse is a great example because is it indoor gaming? Is it outdoor metadata as I walk around? Just defining what it is, I think, remains to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the EU is an interesting example. It does feel, from afar to me at least, that the EU tends to wade in a bit too soon sometimes, and a bit too heavy footstep, because I guess it feels like it should. It's its natural function almost. It's kind of a regulator in some respects. As you and I know, regulators tend to want to regulate, and some of the better ones pull back from time to time. But there's this sort of natural inclination to feel that that's your job.
That's probably the high-level message from my book, is this point about regulation. I think is sometimes necessary. I mean, I'd be odd as an ex-regulator if I didn't believe that.
Yeah.
But there's something about humility. There's something about giving the market a chance. There's something about not trying to predict the future. I mean, if you look back over the last 200, anyone who thinks they can predict what the state of competition is going to be in 10 years' time, you only have to look back 10 years to realise that you can't. I think it's important to be ready to deal with issues that arise.
Yeah.
But I do think there's too great a readiness in the EU to intervene. I mean, when we were part of the EU, I represented the UK on BEREC, the body of European regulators. The EU was never a single, there were always a range of views, I suppose, from the liberal to the more traditional let's regulate stuff. I do worry that the balance has shifted slightly towards the let's regulate.
Yeah.
And that's visible in several current debates, whether that's net neutrality or the telco tax or whatever else you want to pick.
I was actually going to pick up on net neutrality, not so much in the EU context, actually. I was just thinking in my mind, okay, so I kind of get the EU to some degree. It's sort of a cultural thing. It's sort of a factor of its constitution. But what about the US? It feels like, in general, the US is not it will let innovation happen, but every now and again it gets a particular bee in its bonnet about something. Net neutrality is a key example, and it goes all sort of philosophical, and it's a bit like free speech, and suddenly it rushes in to regulate without any kind of real balance in there, but because it suddenly believes it's to be the case. It seems like a different way of regulating.
Again, I would say that the US is not quite as different as we sometimes assume.
Okay.
So certainly on net neutrality, it's gone between the two extremes. I think what's interesting is, of course, everyone agrees we want an open internet. The only question is how you do it, and there have been extremes on how you do it. The other example I find fascinating is actually traditional telecom regulation, local loop unbundling and so on. So if you go back to the 90s, the US had the 1996 Telecoms Act. That was all about promoting local telephone competition. The initial approach taken by the FCC following the 96 Act was incredibly intrusive. What they did was impose very sweeping obligations on the incumbents to unbundle, well, actually everything. So the debate about unbundling is about what do you really need to unbundle and what can others replicate. The initial intervention by the FCC, they had this unbundled network elements platform obligation, which basically said that everything gets unbundled. That's sort of mad. They then went to the other extreme when there was a change of administration and got rid of it completely. So no, I think the US, it's not as different from Europe as you might sometimes imagine.
What is the scope for difference geographically? I mean, to some degree, if you've got a standard, it tends to apply everywhere. And we've seen with things like GDPR, not quite the same thing, but nevertheless, it sort of gets exported everywhere because it's easier for companies and countries just to adopt the most stringent recommendation. But do we see differences historically and now between different countries? And if so, can competition effectively tell us which is the best level of regulation and intervention?
So that, again, is a large part of what I've been trying to do in my book. I think, so what I've tried to do is, so it's 200 years, probably 6 disruptive innovations. And I've picked 5 countries to ask what happened. I mean, to be honest, that's probably not enough, but there's only so much you can fit into a book. So what I've looked at is United Kingdom, United States, France, Germany, and Sweden. And the last 3 are actually picked because Europe is far from homogenous. I mean, Sweden has always been very liberal, for example, so I don't want to caricature where things are in Europe. But you can then track the way in which different markets have responded to different types of change, and you look at outcomes. One interesting example is actually the way in which cable networks developed. So I think, one of the interesting things about broadband is that, of course, in the United States, it's cable that dominates. So like 2/3 of broadband connections are cable. In Europe, cable's always been quite weak as a competitor, hence the need to rely on unbundling and so on. You can trace that difference in cable, I think, largely back to a history of regulation. So in most European countries, actually, Europe invented cable. The first cable network, I think, was in Paris, the Theatrophone, 1889. So, we sort of came up with the idea quite early. For most of the last century, though, European governments prevented cable companies from distributing any additional content over and above that was distributed by the public service broadcasters. So there's a very protectionist approach to the regulation of cable networks designed to protect traditional terrestrial broadcasting. And that basically meant that there was no need to upgrade the capacity of European cable networks. You just didn't have the content you could carry. So you end up with European cable networks that are probably a decade or 2 behind US cable networks. And that's sort of why they are not as effective competitors when you come to the broadband world. So I think that's a good example of how, if you like, different regulatory experiments in the way you deal with cable produce very different outcomes. I mean, the US, by the way, messed up cable early on as well, but they liberalised slightly earlier.
That's a fascinating example because it's persisted for a long time. I'm not sure it had been obvious to me at the time that was going to be an outcome of fewer channels in the UK compared to the US that would lead to a difference. So it does point to something you mentioned at the start about the need for humility, the fact that you've got to be careful what you do because it could lead to some quite different changes.
That's right.
One thing that I perceive to be changing at the moment, and it'd be interesting to know whether this is just a wave in history, is until fairly recently, the main thing with networks was competition, basically. Do you have lots of networks competing with each other, generating rapid rollout, low consumer prices? It feels like the tide is gradually changing towards networks being seen as a part of the critical national infrastructure. They need to be reliable. They need to be everywhere. They need to be pervasive. You need to make sure there's no digital divide. So it's got more of a social role than a price role. And of course, price is important, but it feels like the dial is shifting more towards that kind of element, which would suggest more government intervention in order to deliver the social outcomes. I mean, do you think that's right? And is that something that's happened in the past or a new event?
So it has happened in the past, and I'll come to an example, but it's certainly more so now. And I think for good reason. There's no doubt that, you just look back on pandemic lockdown. If you didn't have broadband, that's a disaster. So there's a national security, there's a set of economic questions, but we're also at a point where if you haven't got broadband, you're just excluded from society. One of my current roles is as a non-executive director of BDUK, which is the executive agency within government oversees Project Gigabit. So that's a program which is all about filling in the gap, trying to work out how far the market will get with fibre deployment, and then recognising that we can't leave the remaining people without anything. So I feel very strongly that needs to be done. So that is a shift, and I think it's important that one does it. It's really important that you do it in a way that doesn't mess up private sector investment in the rest of the market. And I think that's always the challenge, because what you're doing is what you're always doing is sort of intervening because there is a public good, and there is a public good, but you're working in a market where the bulk of the investment that goes in is private sector investment, and you'd be mad to destroy that. So you've got to get that balance right. I can give another example where I think it probably wasn't got right if you go back in history, which is actually the origin of cable and wireless, part of Vodafone, basically. But, basically cable and wireless, it's quite an interesting, entertaining history. So during the 19th century, the UK built the first global communications network of subsea cables. So basically, I think something like 80% of subsea cables were owned out the UK.
Yeah.
And that was very important economically, but it also was regarded as very important from a national security perspective. So actually the first telegraph message that went round the world went round what they called the all red, basically a communications network which only ever touched UK imperial territory in those days. Different times, I think. So you had this global network which was regarded as critically important for the empire. Then what happened is that Marconi came along. He came along initially with long-wave wireless, which didn't work very well. But then during the 1920s, you had beam wireless, short-wave wireless. That basically undercut the subsea cables. And that created a worry that the subsea cable network would essentially go bust, or I think the view, even worse, was it might get bought by the Americans. So what happened, I think around 1928, was a deal was done whereby the network of subsea cables, which were privately owned, were merged with Marconi's wireless company to create cable and wireless. And prices were kept artificially high to protect national security.
Right.
Of course, it failed miserably, because what actually happened is it gave the opportunity to particularly RCA in America to dominate the market. But that was another example of an intervention to protect national security by essentially removing the threat from a new technology, wireless, and it backfired.
Yeah, so be careful if you intervene in that respect, because you may effectively open the door for a competitor that you don't perhaps really want.
In this case, America, yes.
Yeah. So I can think of another sort of area of current sort of intervention, particularly here in the UK, which is Open RAN, which is the government essentially saying, we don't think there's enough diversity in the supply chain in telecoms. It's really only Ericsson and Nokia now that Huawei is banned. We want to see more diversity there. We're going to try and engineer that by both helping out the O-RAN companies, but also leaning on the operators to use O-RAN. At the moment, I think the leaning is just gentle kind of persuasion, but there are discussions about whether it should become some kind of obligatory target that they should hit 15% of their network by a certain date should be O-RAN. What's your take on on that. I mean, that feels like something that also has the potential to backfire or to lead to unintended consequences if we go too far, too fast.
It's not black and white. So firstly, I think that a lot of people who are interested in Open RAN. I wrote an article 2 or 3 years ago, there is some alignment between what industry wants and what government wants, in the sense that operators want a choice of supplier. And as part of that, we all know that companies like Telefonica and Vodafone are exploring Open RAN as part of one of the options that might be available. So that's there's some alignment. In that context, I think government's putting a fair bit of money into pump prime some R&D, if you like, into Open RAN. Again, I think that's fine. Yeah. Obviously, the worry arises when one starts to... I mean, none of us know whether Open RAN will succeed. None of us know whether, if it does succeed, it will be any better, crudely. Yeah. One of the obvious things for me about Open RAN is... I mean, the part of the concern is the way in which the supply chain is dominated by a small number of, upstream equipment manufacturers. The issue for me, one issue, of course, is there are 2 reasons for that. One is interoperability. So, you have to provide the whole suite. But the other obvious issue, particularly as you go out into the radio access network, is commoditization. Yeah. So even if a company could enter the market and just supply a radio base station, I suspect you still need global scale to be able to get your cost base down enough to compete. And I think that means that it's just one of those markets where you're never going to have lots of SMEs providing the service. And that's a shame in some ways. But I think it's... So, again, the trick is... I think there's an interesting question as whether Open RAN opens up some niches where scale is less critical and also provides entry opportunities. It's a bit of a disruption of this. So there's benefits, but it's worth exploring. I think we need to be very careful to think we know the answer. Yeah.
So we're getting to the end. What's your overall take on where regulators are at the moment? Do you worry that they're over-regulating and hence they do need to step back and be a bit more, have a bit more humility, as you say, understand a bit more their roles? Do you think it's about right, or do you think it's actually a complete mishmash across the world with some one extreme, some at another?
I think it's a mishmash. And sometimes they just have to do what they're told, crudely. Yeah. So if I give 2 UK examples, Ofcom's current proposals on net neutrality make a lot of sense to me. They sort of go back to where we were in terms of a much more effects-based framework. And what they've also made clear is that going any further requires action by government. So I think that what Ofcom is proposing on net neutrality makes a lot of sense. The other big thing, though, that is about to be handed to Ofcom is online harms. I really worry about the OSB. I think I once counted up the number of clauses in the OSB and the number of essentially there's several hundred judgments that we're asking platforms to make about whether content is harmful. So I worry that OSB is a monster.
That's the online safety bill, is it?
Yes, online safety bill. So on the one hand, I think Ofcom's proposal on net neutrality great. Yeah. On the other hand, I worry the online safety bill is... There needs to be regulation, clearly, but I would say more judicious.
Yeah. And your point about politics and government is actually something that's come up in some of the earlier podcasts, that actually it's often when politicians start interfering that the problems start happening, and because they don't quite have the background or the humility sometimes, but of course they have the power and they have other reasons for wanting to intervene.
And I would say, in fairness, there are some dreadful things happening online. I can understand why there is a clear need to react. Some of the stuff that happens online is clearly unacceptable. It's just much easier to say there's a problem than come up with a sensible answer. And my worry is the answer is far too intrusive, both in terms of, in that particular case, whether it's even workable, but also, if it is workable, what it does to freedom of expression. There's a very clear risk that the safe path for companies being asked to make all these judgments is just to take stuff down if there's any risk to them.
Yeah. So actually you end up with something that's in many cases worse than the problem that you set out to solve in the first place, potentially.
But it's just different. I mean, you may have fixed one problem and created another. So that's, especially if you're threatening to put people in prison if they don't take content down, they're probably going to take a cautious view of what they need to do.
Yeah.
And that is the current position, I think.
Yeah. Fascinating. My history only went back really to about the 1970s or 1980s. So it's been really interesting to kind of to learn that actually a lot of what we're seeing now is really a repeat of what's happened in the past. And I guess there are many adages about history repeats itself and so on, which is pretty true in this case. It does sound like there's a lot we could potentially learn, and probably it would help people have a bit more humility if they did read some of the lessons of the past. When can they do that? How's the book going?
I keep finding out new. It's the problem with writing a book is you keep finding out new things. I'm about ready to send it to my publisher, but I have to be careful I don't discover something else I want to investigate. You must have had the same problem, William. You've written several books. It's fun doing the research, and at some point you have to stop doing the research and write it down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, it should be. I mean, it makes for a good book when there's so much passion involved in it.
Yeah.
Steve, thank you. I really look forward to seeing that, and it's been great to chat with you again. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Lovely to talk to you, William. Bye now.